Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here today. Hope you're enjoying the festival so far. I'm Stella Levantesi. Next to me is Dr. Benjamin Franta. He's a senior research fellow in climate litigation at the Oxford Sustainable Law Program and the founding head of the Climate Litigation Lab. His research focuses on applying rigorous methods to practical challenges presented by climate litigation, and he has been published in Nature Climate Change, Global Environmental Change, The Guardian, and cited in the US Congressional Record. He holds a PhD in applied physics from Harvard University and a separate PhD in history of science from Stanford University, and he is also a licensed attorney and a member of the State Bar of California.
Thanks, Stella. Stella Levantesi is an Italian climate journalist, photographer, and author. She's the author of I Bugiardi del Clima. I've never spoken Italian before, so The Climate Liars. So you kind of just heard, baby's first words in Italian. And this is a book investigating climate change denial history and tactics, published in Italy with La Terza Editori, and translated into German under the title Klimalügen. She has an MA from New York University's Journalism Institute, and her work has been published in The Guardian, The New Republic, Wired, DeSmog, Nature Italy, and others. Stella is the author of Gaslit, a regular column on DeSmog that seeks to navigate society's dysfunctional relationship with fossil fuel disinformation. Her main areas of expertise are climate change delay and denial, climate litigation, obstruction tactics to climate action, and other climate issues. Stella is a TEDx speaker, and her TED Talk on climate change denial is entitled The Dominance Illusion, Chi mente sul clima e perché. That's my second Italian line of my life. Who lies about climate and why? So we'll start off with a question for Stella. So Stella, what do you see as the obstacles to climate action today, based on your work? And why are we still struggling with pushing climate action, even though there's scientific knowledge of the climate crisis and increasing evidence all around us?
So we know that there's widespread inaction, and more than sort of passive inaction, it's most times intentional, strategic, communicative, and operational obstruction by vested interest to either delay or obstruct climate action. And since we're at a journalism festival, I thought it could be useful to sort of start from one of the stories that I worked on as an example for this. So I worked on a story which was part of a wider series between 2022 and 2023. I worked on it with DeSmog, and was supported by the Journalism Fund. And it was about sort of gas lobby attitudes in the wake of the war in Ukraine, the gas lobby in Europe. And this specific story was about how the gas lobby was sort of leveraging energy security narratives and themes to lock in more gas investments and infrastructure. And I worked on it with a researcher, and we analyzed tweets by 4 big gas lobby groups in Europe, whose members also include big oil and gas companies like Shell, Total, BP, Italian oil and gas company Eni. And basically we found that in the 10 months prior to Russia invading Ukraine in February 2022, the mention of energy security and the energy security narrative was about in 3% of the total amount of tweets. And in the 10 months after Russia invaded Ukraine, it shot up tenfold and was present in about a third of the tweets. So this was sort of a good way to find out about some of the narratives that the gas lobby was using. And it was sort of the tip of the iceberg also of this energy security narrative increasingly being also leveraged and used in lobbying efforts and in, for example, meetings at the EU policy level and in more generally in political public discourse. And this is particularly relevant for Italy because Italy was actually one of the countries in Europe to sign most gas deals at the time. And Eni's CEO was talking about energy security in calls with financial analysts 3 weeks after Russia invaded Ukraine. And it's present in the political discourse to the point that our Ministry of the Environment has been renamed Ministry of the Environment and Energy Security. So again, this is sort of a very concrete example on social media of the narratives being used, but that were present sort of at a more macroscopic scale throughout Europe. And this was also something else that we found that was interesting, was that this narrative, paired with promotion of domestic gas production, paired with sort of leveraging fears for winter shortages, was present against a sort of steady backdrop of other narratives that were used, and these were sort of greenwashing language, such as using terms like renewable gases or low carbon gases, and also this narrative and this idea of promoting gas as a clean fuel and promoting the gas industry as being part of the solution to the climate crisis. And this, I think, is a good example, a tangible example of how most of these climate obstruction strategies work, right? So they tend to be updated, they tend to be renewed as responses or weaponization of current crises by vested interests such as the fossil fuel industry. But they also, vested interests, maintain more traditional strategies like greenwashing, for example. And so we've known about the fossil fuel industry disinforming for a very long time. And I'd like to ask you, Ben, if you can tell us a bit about sort of how this came about. How did we know about fossil fuel companies lying in the first place? And what was the role of investigative journalism in this climate accountability space?
Absolutely. So journalism played a key role in uncovering the history of what the fossil fuel industry knew about climate change and when, and that has driven these historic lawsuits against the fossil fuel industry. Climate lawsuits have existed for decades. Actually, the first climate lawsuit was filed in 1986, and through the 90s and the 2000s, but many of those lawsuits were based on what we might call a traditional environmental law, based on Endangered Species Act or Clean Air Act, environmental laws, and I'm giving examples from the US, but in general, these sorts of laws. In 2015, sort of a new set of journalistic discoveries were published that show that ExxonMobil had a secret research program on climate change starting in the late 1970s and extending into the 1980s. And many of the documents from that research program are shocking. They predict exactly how much global warming would happen and has happened, and many of the impacts. And of course, that completely reframed the well-known history of that company's denial of climate science throughout the 1990s and since then. And of course, ExxonMobil was not alone. As more journalism was conducted, other companies were discovered to have known very similar things, Shell and so on. And groups like the American Petroleum Institute, which is a trade association that disseminated that knowledge to basically all the oil companies in the US and around the world. So the whole industry was aware of climate science basically since the 1980s, and some of the companies earlier than that. And so that was really the fuel, no pun intended, to drive these lawsuits, which started to be filed around 2017 and have been progressing since then. And there are many kinds of climate lawsuits around the world. There are human rights-based lawsuits, there are lawsuits against governments, and so on. And they're proliferating and diversifying. But some of these lawsuits, in particular in the US, are for damages, for climate change adaptation costs and actual damages caused by climate change already. And very similar to tobacco litigation, asbestos litigation, and so on. It's for a lot of money, these lawsuits. A huge amount of money is at stake, probably trillions of dollars in damages, an order of magnitude larger than the tobacco litigation. And so, there's never been a set of lawsuits with higher stakes at least financially, and probably in many other ways as well. So the future of the industry hangs in the balance with some of these lawsuits, and they're driven by journalistic research and scientific research. So that sort of, I think, sets some of the framework, and we can go in so many different directions in, you know, what kinds of lawsuits are being pursued. There are lawsuits about the offsetting industry. There are lawsuits, you know, against governments, which are also very important for policy and so on. So that's kind of a scene-setting way of kind of setting the table. I'll kick it back to you, Stella. And, you know, I mentioned some of the carbon offsetting issues, and those often have to do with greenwashing. And greenwashing is a big area in climate journalism and litigation today. I think we have probably all seen some of the advertisements that we might think of as greenwashing. I think, you know, if we got on a plane to get here, we might have seen an ad when we sat down in our chair that all about, you know, carbon neutrality or using banana peels to make biofuels or something like that. We all know they're common, and so many of these lawsuits are about that too. You know, are these companies actually doing what they're promoting themselves as doing? So I'm going to kick this back to you, Stella, and ask about these companies today, which are increasingly trying to be perceived as sustainable. And can you talk about some of the tactics used by the industry to greenwash their image and how to combat those tactics?
So greenwashing today is increasingly common. Companies really want us to think that they're green, that they're sustainable, that they're part of the solution to the climate crisis and not part of the problem. And from a strictly legal perspective, greenwashing is basically misleading advertising. But greenwashing can be expressed in a number of different ways. So there's claims that are so-called selective truths or omissions. There's suggestive imagery or sounds being used. There's outright lying in greenwashing. But again, greenwashing is not a new strategy. So it's been around for a while. And in the 1980s, oil and gas company Chevron in the United States circulated this ad campaign called People Do that showed its employees protecting wildlife and the environment. And so this sort of is considered one of the early examples of big oil greenwashing. And it basically what it did was not only mislead consumers, but also avoid responsibility for harmful activities. So basically it was shifting responsibility from the harmful products of the company to the consumers. And this is an idea that is, and a strategy that is intentionally being used today. Another idea is the idea of association. So companies associating themselves with a green image. They do this through sponsorships as well, not just greenwashing. So sponsorships of music festivals, museums, science museums, art exhibitions, research by partnering with research centers and universities. And not only to sort of maintain that social license, but also, again, to promote that positive association. But again, this isn't a new strategy. So in the 1940s and 50s, there was a series of tobacco ads that read the tagline, "More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette." And this ad was basically aiming to sort of promote that associative link between smoking and the role of the doctor, which is tied to health and sort of that scientific role. So again, this idea of association. And I'm going to use some words from an expert that I interviewed a while back. His name is Clemens Kaupa. He's based in the Netherlands, and he says greenwashing aims to normalize harmful commodities. And basically that's what most of these companies that are greenwashing are doing. Their activities or product is inherently harmful, it's inherently polluting, and so in a situation where there's a lot of pressure for them to be sustainable, to be actually part of the solution and not the problem, they are greenwashing their image to again, promote that positive association, or divert responsibility or avoid responsibility altogether. And more to the point, I think what is interesting here is, why are we even talking about greenwashing? Why do we care about greenwashing? And the reason for that is that greenwashing is proved to be harmful to the public. There's a study that came out in May last year which shows how persistent greenwashing is, and even potentially reversible. So the study found that even a one-time exposure to 2 30-second fossil fuel ads was enough to positively influence people about the perceived investments of that company into renewable energy, and that even when presented with accurate data about those companies' investments, this wasn't enough to sort of correct that initial greenwashing impact or reverse that effect. And so this is really, again, a very tangible example of why, when we're talking about climate disinformation and climate obstruction, unfortunately, facts and science aren't enough. They're crucial, but they're not enough. And this is why we need journalism that really uncovers and reveals the strategies. The more we understand how they work, the more we understand how these mechanisms work, the more we're able to recognize them, and the more we're able to use them in combating climate obstruction and in addressing sort of climate disinformation altogether. And another way to do this, obviously, is through litigation, as Ben was saying. Litigation is increasing against companies, against polluting companies all over the world. There was a very important case last year, which was announced against Italian oil company Eni by 2 environmental groups in Italy, by Greenpeace and Recommon. And I reported on the story when it broke in May last year. And again, again, this idea of presenting evidence with the lawsuit, which was based on internal documents that showed how the company knew about the risks posed by burning of its product since the 80s. And some more work that I did with Diesmog, and the story was co-published with The Guardian, about how the company was already promoting gas as a clean fuel in the 70s and 80s, and at the time they were calling it methane in their internal sort of magazine and other communications. But again, just goes to show how all of these strategies are being repeatedly used. And this is sort of a story that we've already heard with Exxon and with other companies, but this is particularly relevant and important because Eni has sort of a unique role in the sense that it is very entrenched in the political, institutional, economic, cultural system in Italy. And so compared to other big oil and gas companies, it has undergone very little scrutiny until very recently. So to that point, I want to ask you, Ben, sort of how is journalistic evidence being used in legal cases today? And if there's some other sort of pivotal cases that you can talk to us about.
Absolutely. So, just to build on the greenwashing aspect, it's something that is, I think the damage caused by greenwashing is often underestimated because, what it actually does is waste time. It wastes time that you can't get back when you're trying to stop climate change. And that's been the whole problem basically for the last 30 years, is wasting time on ineffective solutions and ineffective actions, or just slowing things down. And that's been the holding pattern that the industry has been so effective at creating. It's the same thing the tobacco industry did, was try to create a holding pattern to slow things down. And that's what the fossil fuel industry has done. Now, why this is so bad, of course, is climate change is basically irreversible. So the more time we waste, that's damage and alterations and losses that cannot be gotten back, right? They cannot be reversed. And something that's really interesting is that back in the 1980s, we know this from the internal documents of the fossil fuel companies, when public policy started to be formulated to stop climate change, and this is in the late 1980s, 1988, 1989. This is when the fossil fuel companies organized themselves to create a counter movement to stop that action. And actually, one of the internal documents from Exxon, which was a presentation to the board of Exxon in 1989, it makes the direct comparison with the Montreal protocols, which were, designed to phase out ozone depleting chemicals around the world, and which have been pretty successful, and they're still in place and still important. But they had just been implemented at that time. And the whole point of the internal strategy developed by Exxon and then shared with oil companies all around the world and implemented in tandem was to prevent the same success with fossil fuels, to prevent fossil fuel controls the way that ozone depleting chemical controls had been implemented. So we know that that was the strategy from the fossil fuel industry the entire time. And what's really interesting is we know what their specific strategies were for accomplishing that goal. And one of them was argue with climate science, say the science is uncertain, and that's kind of classic climate denials that we were familiar with. Another one was say it's too expensive to control fossil fuels, and actually the economic costs of climate change itself are not that bad. So it's kind of weaponizing economics. And then the third, which is most relevant to greenwashing, is to propose alternative solutions that would actually not hurt the fossil fuel industry. And the first three ideas back in 1989 that the industry came up with were promote fossil gas or natural gas, promote carbon offsets, still very relevant today, and promote efficiency as an adequate solution. So we'll just make things more efficient. Those were the first three false solutions, fake and phony and fraudulent solutions that the fossil fuel industry came up with in order to perpetuate its business for as long as possible. And so then we see this whole kind of creation of climate denial in the 1990s, well documented and promulgated by front groups and coalitions, generally composed of fossil fuel interests. And then what's really interesting is that in 1998, there is a really sudden shift in the fossil fuel industry's public statements about climate change. And this is just about exactly when the tobacco industry had to pay $200 billion in the master settlement agreement with all the litigation going on in the US, the biggest legal settlement ever, I think still, definitely at that time and I think still. And so at that very moment, the fossil fuel industry stopped overtly denying climate change and shifted into its greenwashing stance and said, of course we believe climate change is real and we're the solution to it, and look, we're solving it. And so that's when we see all these ads start to come out from Chevron and BP and so on saying, look, we're solar companies now. Look, we're doing biofuels, we're doing hydrogen, we're doing carbon capture, and you can make a list of all the solutions that they are proposing, and just empirically, none of them have worked. And yet, they have convinced people, many people, for the last 25 years, essentially, that the companies are fixing the problem. Meanwhile, they're actually increasing fossil fuel production the entire time. So, we think of climate denial as sort of the main problem, maybe, but just historically, it's been greenwashing. It's been greenwashing the last 25 years, and that's been the main mode of slowing things down. So I know it's a little different from litigation per se, but that is a really interesting history, and I think that's why greenwashing is so important to address, and it's something that journalism is really well equipped, I think, to address. We see all these companies today saying, we're going to be net zero, we're working on the problem. I mean, they're in major greenwashing mode still, and saying, we're going to do carbon capture, we're going to do hydrogen fuel, we're going to do biofuels, we're doing offsets. All of those things can be investigated and objectively verified or not. You know, where are the business plans for the carbon capture? If they're actually doing it, these are companies that make business plans that go out 30 or 40 years. They should have those documents to verify they actually are doing that and they're actually investing that money, but they're not, you know. And so that can be objectively verified. We don't have to take their word for that. And that's all relevant to litigation. So right now, a great example is this Shell case going on in the Netherlands. This is a whole other area of litigation which seeks to make the Paris Agreement's goals legally binding, basically. And, you know, first with the Urgenda case against the Dutch government, which was successful and a huge breakthrough. It's been replicated in various other countries, Belgium and some others. But then taking the same approach and suing fossil fuel companies and saying, as a matter of social duty, these companies have to decarbonize, including their product chains, in alignment with the goals of the Paris Agreement, as a reasonable standard of behavior. Anything less would be unreasonable. So that's been a really interesting area of lawsuits, and they just, you know, so I don't want to get ahead of myself here. You know, that case was successful in the lowest court. The court ordered Shell to decarbonize, reduce its carbon emissions, including from its products, by about 50% by 2030. So that means a court order to shift one of the biggest fossil fuel companies in the world away from fossil fuels. I mean, it's an enormously monumental court order. That was appealed by Shell, and just like in the last few weeks, they've had the hearings for that appeal. And, you know, Shell is arguing, we're actually already doing this. You know, we're actually doing everything we can to decarbonize. Well, that's something that journalism can actually investigate and kind of, you know, answer. You know, are they actually doing that or not? Because if they are, there should be a paper trail, there should be a money trail, there's a personnel trail, there are business plan trails. And if they're not, then there won't be those things. So, you know, that's hugely monumental. So I guess that's just another example of, you know, how journalism is absolutely key to the most important lawsuits, or at least among the most important lawsuits ever in the history of law, I would argue, because they're so important for the future of the world.
Thanks, Ben. I think we have a couple minutes for questions, if anyone has questions. You want to keep talking about this? I mean, Ben and I could go on for ages, but yeah.
So Adam Levy, climate journalist and YouTuber. Of course, it's not just companies that are trying to greenwash themselves, it's also entire nations. What's the difference then in the role of reporting in calling out that kind of greenwashing versus the kind of greenwashing we've been speaking about here?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yes, definitely we have examples of political leaders, political parties, governments greenwashing their way out of things or away from things. Italy, unfortunately, is a very good example of that. So again, we have a government that has a very, or allows very big access to fossil fuel or industry, more generally industry sort of interests. And so that also means that policy lines sometimes will follow industry interests rather than what is in the public interest. In terms of differences, I'm not entirely sure that there's sort of some substantive differences to sort of reporting on how a government would greenwash or how companies greenwash. And also some of the arguments that are being used are kind of the same. So this idea of, for example, promoting gas as a clean fuel is present both in the political discourse and in what companies are communicating. Maybe the sort of core difference would be in the consequences of that reporting. So some companies have a more predatory approach towards journalistic scrutiny, and some governments also. We are experiencing a moment in journalism that is quite hard in terms of like slap suits and requests for damages as well. A lot of reporters are being sued and are in very complicated situations. So that's also something to consider. I don't know, I hope that partially answered your question. Ben, maybe you want to add something?
Sure. Just from a legal perspective, we're seeing a lot of movement in human rights-based law around climate change, then that generally applies to governments. So investigating what governments are doing or not doing about climate change can directly inform suits based on human rights. And you know, we just saw this judgment from the European Court of Human Rights just I think last week, finding that that Switzerland's action on climate change was inadequate and it was a violation of human rights articles. And Switzerland's not alone, of course. I mean, it's basically in the same situation as almost every other government around the world. So that has huge ramifications. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights is preparing an advisory opinion on climate change. That's going to have large impact. The International Court of Justice is going to do the same. So yeah, there's kind of this parallel track where if tort law, you know, is being used against corporations, you've got human rights law as a basis for action against governments, and that can be informed by the journalistic work as well.
I actually thought of something else too, which is the relationship with the media more generally. So if a political leader uses a greenwashing claim in their sort of public discourse or in arguments to the public, it'll more generally be circulated within media or sort of reported by media as sort of like, this politician said this, and that, right? And that may be reiterating or fueling that greenwashing message. And this is probably would happen more often with that relationship with the political institution or figure rather than a company. It's harder for like mainstream media to be reporting on what companies are communicating. So that's also something to think about if you're in the, if you have a role of a reporter who wants to uncover that kind of thing, then there needs to be clarity about how mainstream media is going about those issues as well, and if they're helping in sort of uncovering and scrutinizing the greenwashing, or actually helping circulate and confuse and deceive more, inadvertently or not. Yes.
Thank you. So my name is Hussein Bahagat. I'm from Egypt. Two questions about litigation from experience. One is, I mean, there seems to be this emphasis on climate litigation, and of course, I mean, my organization and others are involved in this quite a bit before COP27 in Egypt and beyond. But it looks like because we have to be honest here, a lot of this is of course dependent on donors and grant support because that's what supports the litigation. There seems to be an increasingly narrow understanding of what climate litigation means that doesn't incorporate the infrastructure of this litigation, which is work on corporate accountability and corporate capture, even if it doesn't necessarily mean oil and gas and climate. If we don't challenge corporates for their behaviors, if we don't challenge the corporate capture of states and state interest, and we saw what happened in the Emirates, of course, when the head of the oil company was the president of COP28, then we're not even going to make it to the climate cases and the climate arguments. And the problem is, it seems that with the donor interest shifting so closely to what's in fashion now, unfortunately, which is climate litigation, they don't understand that corporate accountability and corporate capture litigation is in fact climate litigation. Is this something that you're seeing also beyond our region? And the second thing is, my second question is another challenge, is tort litigation is absolutely essential, and it only hurts if it's done in the host, in the HQ countries. So if we want to challenge Shell, of course it matters the cases that are brought in Egypt and in South Africa, but it matters more the case that is brought in the Netherlands that you mentioned. Why is it so expensive? I mean, what can we do about this? How can you, I mean, how could it cost $100,000 in Canada to bring a civil lawsuit, and that's before the liability and before the litigation costs? And I mean, I'm sorry if your lab has already worked on this, but we've been doing jurisdiction research and shopping to bring cases, and it's just prohibitive. It's impossible to bring lawsuits against these companies in the US, in Canada, in the UK. So what to do about this?
These are great questions. Thanks so much. So I'm gonna, say a couple things for you for people to think about. I don't think litigation's expensive. It costs maybe $10 million, $50 million to sue Exxon. I think that's a deal. That's a bargain. If it costs $50 million and 8 to 10 years to bring to heel one of the biggest fossil fuel companies in the world and extract hundreds of billions of dollars for climate adaptation, I think that's a great deal. If you think about all the money spent on climate every year, all the subsidies for carbon capture and so on. So, that's just kind of food for thought. I think for the scale of the impact that we're talking about, I don't think litigation's that expensive. The second thing is that, it's true that much of the litigation around the world is dependent on philanthropy, but not all of it. And, again, I'm thinking of the damages litigation, first in the US, but increasingly spreading around the world. And these cases are done on contingency, which means the lawyers doing them do them for free, and if they lose, they don't get paid. And if they win, they get like a quarter of the money. Which means you got lawyers who are willing to spend 10 years of their life, maybe not to get paid. And if they win, they become billionaires. So you've got a different kind of lawyer working on that. Very high stakes, very high risk appetite, and they're in it to win. They're not going to do this unless they think there's a good chance they're going to put together a winning case. So some people don't like that. They find that maybe distasteful. But, these are the lawyers who are driving a lot of change and freaking the industry out, quite frankly, because these lawyers are used to taking on big industries and winning. So that's another thing just to kind of to know about. As for, these cases challenge corporate power. In some sense, there's nothing very special about the history of climate change. It's just another example of an industry doing everything it can to keep selling its dangerous product. So it's just another example in the long list of corporate malfeasance examples, but it's maybe the one with the most deleterious impact on the world, and enacted by this industry, which is incredibly powerful. One of the only tools where you can actually attack that is litigation, and that's sort of my loosely held opinion. I know that there's a lot more to it, right? And it's synergistic with grassroots activism, with journalism, with other things too, and with the market forces, of course. But one of the only level playing fields where you can force the industry to the table, get their documents, and force them to pay up and take accountability in the public sphere on record is in the courtroom. So that's sort of my a defense or something like that of litigation, even though it's far from perfect. Of course, it takes a long time. And you're right that maybe it's not it's relatively inexpensive compared to other things, but it's also relatively expensive compared to other things yet. So yeah, it's not viable in every situation, which is one of the challenges. Stella, do you have anything else to add?
No, I think time is up because they're signaling me from the back. I'm sorry, but thank you so much for coming and for listening to us. Thanks so much.